Joining us on the Brisbane Lions Fancast today is list manager Rob Kerr to chat about all things our list. I want to kick it off with a question, Rob. Firstly, welcome to the show. But we've got 3 stars out of contract: Pearce, Hanley, Matthew Leuenberger, and obviously Daniel Rich. Can you give us any update at all, any exclusive on the Fancast today about how that's tracking along?
Okay, well, as far as those 3 players go, they're all managed by Paul Connors, and to be fair to say, I've spent a lot of time discussing those players with Paul Connors over recent weeks. I think with Matthew Leuenberger, we're very, very close to getting a deal, and I think we're pretty, we're not far away with Daniel, and we've been talking about Pearce and working through that one as well. So I'd like to think that in the next couple of weeks, even within the next week for one of them, there'd be some positive news.
That's great news for all the Lions listeners out there, Rob, for sure. Can you just tell us a little bit about that negotiation process? As you said there's the 3 guys are with the one manager. Do you have to take it one at a time, or do you go in there and try and negotiate 3 contracts all at once?
Oh well, Paul's he obviously takes instructions from each of his clients, so he's got an obligation to each individual. We'll try and do them pretty much in the same sort of sit-down sessions, but you'll get to different points in each discussion, and in some cases it's the end result is a little bit of a function of how close we are, how close the club is in terms of reflecting the instructions that he's been given from his client. So we don't package them up, if you like. We do negotiate each one individually, and I suppose those 3 players are currently, you'd have to consider them in our top bracket of most valuable players on our list. So there's not going to be massive discrepancies across the 3 of them, but each has his own. They play different roles. You've got to consider what does each player, what would be his value in the market, what's his value to the club, and when you work through that, and they can be quite lengthy, these negotiations. Obviously, my job is to try and get the best deal for the club, and Paul's job is to try and get the best deal for the player. So sometimes it takes a little bit of time and effort to get to that middle ground where we can both walk away happy that we've done the job for each party which we represent.
There's also a bunch of other players out of contract, as there are every year now. I'm not 100% sure on this list, but I think players like Dane Zorko, Mitch Golby, Billy Longer, Elliot Yeo. Have you advanced far in discussions with other players, or have you been focusing on these 3 first?
No, look, all those players you spoke about have had discussions with their managers. We're probably a bit further advanced with Dane than some of them. The way it plays out too is, particularly with younger players, they often like to see how their season progresses. I suppose if you look at it from their point of view, if you're playing regular senior football, you a more valuable commodity than if you're not. So sometimes younger players will like to wait a little longer before they feel they're in a position to commit, and that's often a function of them getting a sense of their worth to the team in terms of, are they a regular senior player, are they a player who's in and out of the team, or are they a player who still has a fair bit of development time in front of him in the NAFL before he breaks into becoming a regular player. So whilst we as a club can go and talk to players and put offers forward, you can't force anyone to sign. They've obviously got to feel that they're at a stage where they're happy to talk about an agreement which they'd be happy to move forward with.
That point you touched on there, I think, is pretty important, because we heard that Matthew, Daniel, and Pearce at different stages had expressed their desire to stay at the club. Now, particularly in Matthew's instance, there was quite a bit of interest from GWS apparently and other clubs. But did that happen as far as you know, and did that slow down negotiations, or where did
that sit? No, I don't think it slowed down negotiations. The way it works is every club talks to every manager, and the managers will sit down with you and they'll say, right, here's my list of players who are out of contract. You get a little bit sceptical at times because, for argument's sake, if a manager sits in front of you and says a very good player's out of contract, you're naturally going to say, we'd be interested in following that one and seeing how that goes. Now, you don't really ever know of just how deep that interest is, and if it was to be tested, how hard they would pursue a player. So you've pretty much got to negotiate on the basis that player wants to stay at your club. Very rarely, occasionally you'll be told, we don't want to progress discussions at this stage. That's probably when you do get a little bit of a warning light there, if you like. But in terms of the players you're speaking about, it's not been the case that there's been reluctance to talk about the players' futures and staying at Brisbane. And in Matthew's case, he's expressed a desire to stay in Brisbane as the other two boys have. So I think those ones are headed in the right direction.
Most clubs have a player or two that there's often a lot of speculation that they're homesick or they haven't settled in that well. Now, there's a few at the Lions, in particular Pat Karnezis and Jared Pollock, who I know last trade period there was a lot of talk about, and you even commented at one stage that perhaps they hadn't settled in as well as the club had liked. A few months on, almost half a year on from that, do you feel more confident in their position at the club and more confident in some ways of extending their time at the club?
I think those boys probably gets back to a little bit to what I was talking about before. I mean, neither of them's had a strong run of senior football under their belt at this point in the season. So I feel like it's probably going to be a little bit of a case of them wanting to see how their season progresses and just what their role is in the team going forward. Again, had discussions with both those managers and indicated a willingness to begin discussions, and it'd be fair to say that over the next couple of weeks we'll progress those a little further. I think in both cases those players have wanted to see, what level can they play at, and that has a big of an influence on what level their contract's at. So they've been wanting to just test their form out and demonstrate that they're regular senior players.
From the outside, that's my sort of thoughts as well, that people tend to get a little bit jumpy and a bit itchy if players aren't contracted early in the season. Yet I guess with those young guys, they're probably more interested in the on-field stuff, aren't they? Trying to prove themselves rather than getting themselves all worried about contracts after round 5 and round 10 when they've still got half a season to play.
Yeah. I mean, look, it's every club has a around 15 players out of contract at the start of a season. Some cases a few more. There's ones who the reality is you're sitting there saying, okay, well, are they going to step up and make the grade? And from the players' point of view, particularly younger players, their first priority is to prove themselves as AFL footballers and demonstrate that they can command a spot in the best 22. There's often no rush from either side, in fact, to get a contract resolved in the early part of the year. And in most cases, when you talk to managers of that younger bracket of players, the response you get when you start discussing things with them early in the season is, well, let's wait till the middle of the year, and that's kind of the period we're at now. So you'd expect. Well, certainly I'll be doing more work on that younger bracket of players over the next 1 to 2 months.
Rob, we want to get onto the list and draft prospects and whatever in a second, but we can't. It'd be remiss of us to not mention Buddy Franklin. The club's obviously expressed an interest in him, the fact that he's out of contract, and that, hey, I guess Brisbane's been chasing a big forward for a while. So, have you chatted with Liam Pickering, who's Buddy's manager, or is that advanced, or do you leave that till later in the season, or whereabouts?
I've chatted to Liam about a number of players that he's got on his list. Again, as I said, you do sit down with all the managers and work through the players on their list. Someone like Buddy, well, that's a discussion that goes at a level higher than just my good self, I've got to say. that's a whole of club type of decision, that one. So there's an awful lot involved in those sorts of in recruiting those sorts of players. I mean, Buddy's one that his management's indicated that they want to hold things off until the end of the year. But as a club, you've got to do your work up front, and the first question you've got to ask is, well, can you fit a player like that in? And to get to the answer to that, you've really got to progress your own list as far as recontracting and the like goes. I mean, he's obviously one of a group of free agents who would be of interest to most clubs. And as you do with all that bracket of players, you continue to keep in touch with the player agents and see where the player's at and what his thoughts are. And then as a club, you've got to do your work, whether it be Franklin or Thomas or any number of the free agents. There's a fair bit of work that has to go on behind the scenes to satisfy yourselves that you're in a position where you can bid for players of that calibre.
Obviously, a big issue with the list is the future key forward position. When Jonathan Brown does hang up the boots, how wide have you cast your net in terms of finding this next key forward? Because I think it was you who said last year that there's not that many elite key forwards in the competition. So maybe you have to look to things like the State League. I mean, I know there's a few going around in the State Leagues who are going all right. Is that the kind of thing that you're starting to consider and keeping an eye on this year?
Oh well, this year probably. If you look at where key forwards have been drafted from, it's very rare you find a good AFL key forward who wasn't taken in the first 20 or so picks. I think probably Kurt Tippett's one who was a little later, and Sam Reid was one. I'm not sure, but he was either late 20s or early 30s, I think. Other than that, most of them are taken either in a top 10 spot. There's a lot of key forwards who are taken who just don't quite step up and make the grade, because it's probably the hardest position you have to play, or the hardest role for a tall to fill. Now we've gone and looked at state leagues over the last few years. We continue to look at state leagues this year, but it's with the modern system and the way the talent's developed, your best opportunity to find a genuine key forward prospect is probably through the draft. That's not to say that maybe someone doesn't bob up from a state league club, but history says that's pretty rare. And naturally we look through the state leagues, and we have people who scout those competitions and have a sole focus on that. But I wouldn't say I'm super optimistic of finding anyone come through a state league and fill the role that you're looking for them to fill. Now that gets back to it might mean that your structure's a little different over a period of time, and you have to have lead up forwards as opposed to your big hulking traditional key forward. But you certainly have to factor in, and we have to factor in what's the forward line going to look like post Jonathan Brown, and whether you need mids who can kick lots of goals for you, whatever the case is. You do need to do a bit of work there. I mean, and things can change quickly for you, I suppose. A couple of years ago we had Brown, Clark and Favola on our list, and you thought, well, there's with Mitch Clark there's something there for you in the future. But then obviously 12 months passes and you've got neither Clark or Favola there. So they're the hardest things to find, I guess, the key forwards. I think, as I said, there's some optimism around some of the younger players coming through the under-18s this year from a key forward perspective. And it's fair to say, we're doing more than our fair share of work in scouring the country, trying to find someone who can fill that role for us.
That's that's a great summation, Rob. Like, it's really riveting listening, actually. But just with that in mind, you've touched on where the list is at tall forwards wise at the moment. Last year, the club went out and got Marco Paparone, who I guess is that hit-up sort of forward you touched on earlier, Michael Close, who we haven't seen play senior footy yet. Keeping in mind that you got those two guys last year and there's a number of other tall players at the club, do you still persist in looking for that best tall come draft time this year, or are you just prepared to look for best player at the moment?
Oh, look, I think if it came to the draft and you had a real line ball decision between how you rated a tall and a midfielder, you'd have to think very carefully about the tall for the simple reason that, as I said before, if you don't get them early, it's really hard to find the quality ones. By the same token, we also need to bolster our midfield group. So it's going to be a delicate balance and an important decision when the time comes around. But that's where you also, nowadays with free agency, you look at it and think, all right, what can I bring in from a free agent's perspective, if possible, that might help us out in one of those areas? Or can we trade someone in who might help us out in one of those areas? So I think at this early stage that decision is going to be a little bit of a function of whether we can acquire a player who we think can fill a gap for us in one of those two areas. If, for argument's sake, you're able to bring in a good midfielder or two, then you'd probably be leaning towards a tall forward. If it went the other way, you'd be probably leaning towards the good midfielder. But I'd have to say that after early sightings, I think this is a reasonably good draft at the top level. So I think we'd be hoping that we'd be bringing in a pretty good draft pick, and that'd be complemented by someone else that we'd brought in through the other mechanisms.
In regards to that tall forward, key forward position, it's not like you guys haven't actually been trying. I mean, you look at the history, obviously Mitch Clark was there. You had a crack at Dawes last year, you mentioned, and there was also Jesse Hogan, who I know who you wrote in your trade report the club went hard at. The one this year who seems to be the gun key forward is a young kid by the name of Tom Boyd, who I'm sure you need no introduction about. Yeah. How hard would the club go to try and get a pick that could snare Boyd?
Well, it's a good question, that one. It's a good question. I suppose how hard you go, it's early days, but it's going to be a little bit of a function of where you finish and what you think you're going to be able to draft with the pick that you've got in the natural order. Tom Boyd's an attractive proposition for any football club. He's I think he's 199 from memory. He's a big strapping lad who stretches high to mark the footy. He's not afraid to jump across the front of a pack and take a mark, as well as use his height to mark from in front or behind. I guess the best answer I can say is in our decision making, he's going to be a consideration. He's got to be, because he's such a good player. But as I said, there's a few others around this year that he's clearly the best of the tall forwards. But I wouldn't be surprised if there's two or three key position types taken in the first 10 to 12 picks. But in terms of who's the best key forward at the minute, well, he clearly stands up as the best.
I guess we're getting a bit of a view of how complex the whole juggling act is, aren't we, Rob? I guess your decision come draft time might be influenced by the preceding trade period and free agency period. That's obviously fair to say.
Yeah, and this year we've got the added little bit of complexity in that. The very first day of the trade period, is when you'll do your academy bidding exercise. So, just talking to our recruiting team today, made the point that we needed to be more advanced in our assessment of players and what our strategy is than we have been in previous years, because I think it's something like October 4 is when the trade period starts, and that's when you have to bid on your academy players. So if we're going to make a play for one of the academy boys. We need to have decided, okay, this is he's a player who we feel can add something to our list. It's a need that we have to fill, and we also have to put a value on what price we're prepared to pay, whether it be second round, third round, fourth round, whatever the case is. And then once you've done that, as you say, you're going to get through the free agency and the trade period, and the outcomes of those couple of factors are going to shape what your final drafting strategy is. But you need to be very clear when you're making those decisions on how you're assessing that young talent and where you're seeing it in the draft order, and what you think it can add to your group, and how soon it can add something to your group. It's often, expectations are often high on the younger players when they come in, but they're all turning 18 this year. They're all part-time players who train 2 and 3 times a week, and they're underweight. Their endurance is below what it needs to be to play AFL footy. There's a huge gap that they have to bridge, and sometimes I think we expect them to bridge that a little bit earlier. You go and look at players like Jobe Watson, Dane Swan, and there's probably numerous others. A lot of those players didn't really make their mark in AFL footy until their 4th season, and that's simply because they hadn't built the engine or the strength and didn't have the physical capacity to play AFL footy until they got into that period. So there's a lot of factors that you weigh up in your decision making, and you just hope you get it right.
Just on the academy, actually, there's many, I suppose, exciting prospects this year as the first year that it becomes available. Obviously, Isaac Conway's talked about a lot. Kane Tickner, John O'Freeman seems to be going pretty well of late. On top of that, you've got Sam Gribble and also Archie Smith, who looks like quite a promising young ruckman. How hard a challenge is it for you guys to determine which ones of those you actually really want to bid for? Because obviously you've put a lot of development into each of them, and it must be a hard decision to think we're going to have to let some go.
Yeah, well, it is going to be a hard decision because there's been a big investment in all the academy players, and particularly those more elite players that you just named, or those that have the highest level of potential. Academy coach in Scott Borlace this year, and Ash Drake, who works with them, and Luke Curran. They've got a lot of personal investment in them. I suppose the recruiting team really does have to take a hard-nosed view of, all right, well, how does this boy stack up against the rest of the talent in the country? And in the end, to use an old Dennis Pagan saying, the one or two that get picked are really going to pick themselves, and it'll be on the back of strong performances through the under-18 carnival. Probably, I think people in Brisbane would have seen some of these boys play for our NAFL team, and I'd have to say I think sometimes you can maybe get a little bit seduced by their form, and then when they're playing with our seconds, because they're playing around a group of more accomplished players and a better structured group. We really do put a lot of weight on how they go against their peers in the under-18 competition, and in particular the national championships. The last few weeks they've played against some Division 1 teams in South Australia and Vic Metro, it was, wasn't it? We've been able to use that as a bit of a measuring stick, because the fact is most of your talent comes, I think it's 55% comes from Victoria, and this year the South Australian team has a very good group as well. So we've been able to look at our academy boys and taken note of how they've stood up against that tougher competition. Obviously, you've got to give some weighting to the fact that the Queensland team isn't going to be competitive for as long as you'd like when they are playing those teams. But you just look to see, well, how do they compete when they're in the one-on-one situations with their peers? how does their running compare to the running of their peers, and you know, on that topic, it's a really critical factor now is the ability of a boy to run. If he can't run and cover the ground, he's got a long road ahead of him. I'm not sure whether either of you guys saw Kerr Interview, where he spoke about the fact that he was so far behind when he got on the Sydney rookie list, and actually was involved with the New South Wales team that year that he played in the under-18s, and he was a long way behind any of those Division 1 players, and he said it took him two years to get to a level of fitness and to get his skills up to a level where he was able to compete. But if they can show that if they can show they can compete and they can show a rate of improvement, then that's a very good start. If they can actually hold their own in that company and show some really good signs in that Division 1 company, and then translate that into a good series of games in Division 2, then they'll be the players that will elevate themselves.
Well, thanks for joining us on the Fancast today, Rob. I know that fans absolutely love the insight that you give through your trade wraps and your draft wraps, and also through this today. And I know everyone thinks you're doing a great job, so all the best with maintaining the list, and we'll have another chat to you a bit later in the year as the off-season recruitment period gets a little closer.
Okay, no, it's a pleasure, guys. Thanks for your interest.